May 15, 1957, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Helen Evans rolled her book cart past the rows of shelves in the Cedar Rapids Public Library, pausing to check whether The Quiet American had been returned. Graham Greene's latest novel about espionage in Vietnam had a waiting list, but Helen found herself more interested in the geopolitical themes than her patrons seemed to be. Most just wanted a good story. At 42, Helen had spent nearly 20 years as a librarian, taking pride in her meticulous organization and encyclopedic knowledge of the Dewey Decimal System. Her colleagues often joked that she could locate any book in the stacks blindfolded. Widowed during the final days of World War II when her husband's B-17 was shot down over Germany, Helen had found solace in books and the quiet routine of library work. "Mrs. Evans?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. "I was hoping you could help me find some materials." The man standing before her was tall, impeccably dressed in a gray suit that seemed too formal for Cedar Rapids. His accent was faintly Midwestern but with something else beneath it, perhaps Eastern Seaboard polish. "Of course," Helen replied. "What are you looking for?" "My name is William Foster. I'm with the State Department, doing research on municipal infrastructure development." He flashed credentials briefly. "I need access to your city planning archives, particularly anything from the past decade." Helen nodded, though something about the request struck her as odd. "Those records are in our reference section. I can show you." As she led him to the municipal archives, she noticed he carried no briefcase or notepad. For a researcher, he seemed curiously empty-handed. "Over the next 3 weeks, Mr. Foster became a regular visitor." Helen noticed patterns in his research. He focused on water treatment facilities, power substations, and transportation infrastructure. Hardly the stuff of light reading, but there was something in his methodical approach that reminded Helen of herself. On a rainy Tuesday in June, Helen was reshelving books when she noticed Foster had left behind a small notebook. Her first instinct was to place it in the lost and found, but curiosity, the lifeblood of any good librarian, got the better of her. She opened it, expecting notes on Cedar Rapids infrastructure. Instead, she found a series of numbers and letters arranged in 5-character groups. On another page were rough sketches of what appeared to be the Cedar Rapids water treatment facility with notations in a script she didn't recognize. It wasn't English, and with a chill, Helen realized it looked Cyrillic. Helen Evans had never considered herself particularly patriotic. She paid her taxes, voted in elections, and said the Pledge of Allegiance when required. But she was also the woman who had received the telegram about her husband's plane, who had stood straight-backed at his funeral with an empty casket because his body was never recovered. The woman who had spent 12 years quietly rebuilding a life from the fragments the war had left her. The notebook trembled in her hands. She considered returning it, pretending she'd never seen its contents. It would be the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But something about those orderly rows of numbers, the precision of them, gnawed at her. That evening, instead of taking her usual bus home, Helen walked 6 blocks in the opposite direction to the local FBI field office. "I'd like to speak with someone about a potential security matter," she told the receptionist, clutching her purse where she'd placed the notebook. An hour later, Helen sat across from Special Agent Zachary O'Connor, a square-jawed man with prematurely gray hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much. "Mrs. Evans, I understand you have concerns about a patron at your library," he said, his voice neutral. "Yes." Helen carefully removed the notebook and placed it on the desk between them. "This belongs to a man calling himself William Foster. He claims to be with the State Department, researching municipal infrastructure." O'Connor flipped through the notebook, his expression unchanging except for a slight tightening around his eyes. "Have you spoken with anyone else about this?" "No. I came directly here." "Good." He studied her for a moment. "Mrs. Evans, I'd like you to continue your normal routine. If Foster asks about his notebook, tell him you haven't seen it. Can you do that?" Helen nodded, though her heart raced at the thought of lying to the man's face. And Mrs. Evans? This conversation never happened. The next day, William Foster approached her desk, looking slightly agitated. "Mrs. Evans, I seem to have misplaced a small black notebook. I wonder if anyone turned it in." Helen's hands grew clammy, but she kept her face composed as she'd practiced all night. "I'm sorry, Mr. Foster. Nothing's been turned in today. Perhaps you left it somewhere else." His eyes, calculating and cold, studied her for a moment too long. "Perhaps. Thank you anyway." He didn't return to the library that week, or the next. Helen began to think perhaps it was over, whatever it was. Then, on a Sunday afternoon as she walked home from church, a dark sedan pulled alongside her. "Mrs. Evans," Agent O'Connor said from the passenger window, "would you mind coming with us? There are some questions we'd like to ask." The FBI field office was nearly empty on a Sunday. O'Connor led her to a sparse conference room where another man waited. He didn't introduce himself, but his bearing suggested authority. "Mrs. Evans," O'Connor began, "the notebook you brought us contains coded messages consistent with Soviet intelligence tradecraft. William Foster is not who he claims to be." The unnamed man spoke. "We believe he's part of a network operating throughout the Midwest, focusing on critical infrastructure. Your discovery may be significant." "What do you want from me?" Helen asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your cooperation," O'Connor said. "Foster, or whatever his real name is, has disappeared, but he'll need to reconnect with his network. When he does, we want to be there." "You want me to spy on him?" Helen asked incredulously. "We want you to help us protect national security," the unnamed man corrected. "Your position at the library gives you access and a reason to notice things without arousing suspicion." Helen thought of her husband, of the empty casket, of the years she'd spent cataloging books while the world rebuilt itself from war only to dive into a new kind of conflict, colder but no less dangerous. What would I need to do? Over the next 2 months, Helen received training in rudimentary counterintelligence techniques. She learned to recognize surveillance, memorize license plates, and notice patterns in seemingly random visits to the library. The FBI installed a special phone line in her home and taught her recognition codes for emergency communication. "Foster will return," O'Connor assured her. "His network needs the information he was gathering. Someone will come to continue his work." Sure enough, in late August, a new patron appeared. A woman in her 30s who introduced herself as Catherine Miller, a doctoral student researching urban development patterns. She requested access to the same municipal records Foster had been examining. Helen alerted O'Connor using their prearranged signal, a specific book placed on hold under a fictional patron's name. The FBI began surveillance of Catherine Miller. Through careful observation, Helen noticed that Miller always visited on Thursdays, always left precisely at 4:30 p.m., and always stopped at the same diner 3 blocks away. More suspiciously, she never took notes from the materials she studied, despite spending hours reviewing technical documents. O'Connor's team followed Miller to a motel on the outskirts of town, where she met briefly with a man who matched Foster's description. The net was widening. Helen's role expanded. She began tracking other suspicious patrons who requested unusual materials, agricultural reports, factory locations, railroad timetables. She created a cross-referenced card catalog of visitors, materials requested, and patterns of behavior. "You think like an intelligence analyst," O'Connor told her admiringly after she identified connections between 3 seemingly unrelated visitors. By November, The FBI had identified 7 individuals connected to what they now believed was a Soviet intelligence operation spanning multiple Midwestern states. The targets were America's heartland infrastructure, water supplies, power grids, transportation networks, and agricultural centers. Then came the day when Helen's carefully constructed double life nearly collapsed. She was closing the library, alone after her assistant called in sick, when she heard the door open behind her. "I'm sorry, we're closed," she called without turning. "Hello, Mrs. Evans," said a familiar voice. "Or should I call you something else?" William Foster stood blocking the exit, his pleasant demeanor replaced by cold calculation. "Mr. Foster, you haven't been in for some time," Helen said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Did you find your notebook?" "That's an interesting question." He took a step toward her. "Especially since I never lost it." Helen felt ice spread through her veins. "I don't understand." "I think you do. I think you understand perfectly." He moved closer. "Who did you give it to, Mrs. Evans? FBI? Military intelligence?" Helen's mind raced. The emergency signal required access to a telephone, which Foster was blocking. The FBI agents who occasionally watched the library would have left when the library closed. "I'm just a librarian, Mr. Foster. A librarian who recognizes Cyrillic script when she sees it. A librarian who somehow isn't fooled by State Department credentials that have worked across 3 states. His smile never reached his eyes. "You're more than just a librarian. What do you want?" Helen asked. "I want to know how much you've compromised, who you've spoken to, what you've told them." He glanced at his watch. "And we don't have much time." Helen realized with sickening clarity that Foster believed she was a professional counterintelligence officer. The thought was almost laughable. A widow who'd spent her life among books suddenly thrust into a world of international espionage. "There are people expecting me," she said, attempting to bluff. "If I don't arrive home." "Please don't insult me," Foster interrupted. "Your phone has been monitored. You live alone. No one is expecting you anywhere." Helen took a step backward, bumping into her desk. Her hand brushed against the heavy metal stapler she'd been using to attach overdue notices. "You've caused considerable disruption, Mrs. Evans." Foster's accent had changed, the Midwestern inflection dropping away to reveal something Eastern European. "We've had to suspend operations, relocate personnel. It's very inconvenient." "I'm sorry to hear that," Helen replied, wrapping her fingers around the stapler. Foster lunged forward suddenly, grabbing her wrist. "No more games. You will tell me exactly." Helen swung the stapler with all her strength, striking him on the temple. Foster staggered backward, more surprised than injured. She used the moment to dash past him toward the reference section, where a fire exit led to the alley behind the building. She heard him pursuing as she navigated the familiar stacks in the dimming light. The fire alarm would sound when she opened the emergency exit, but that might actually help her now. As she rounded the biography section, a figure stepped out from between the shelves. Catherine Miller blocked her path, a small pistol fitted with a suppressor in her hand. "That's far enough," Miller said calmly. "You've led us on quite a chase, Mrs. Evans." Foster caught up, blood trickling from his temple. "Search her," he ordered Miller. "Then we're taking her with us. The network needs to know exactly what she's compromised." As Miller approached, Helen's mind raced through her limited options. She thought of the card catalog she'd created for O'Connor, the patterns she'd identified, the connections she'd mapped. Where in those patterns might salvation lie? "Thursday," Helen said suddenly. Miller hesitated. "What?" "It's Thursday. You always come to the library on Thursday, then go to the diner at 4:30. You never break pattern." Helen looked at her watch pointedly. "It's 6:15. Someone will have noticed you broke routine. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Miller's face. She glanced at Foster. She's bluffing, he said. Search her. But Helen saw the seed of doubt she'd planted. Agent O'Connor has been tracking your movements for weeks, she continued. The diner owner works with the FBI. When you didn't show up today, they would have initiated surveillance on the motel. It was a desperate fabrication based on fragments of what Helen had observed of the FBI's methods. But Miller's hand wavered slightly. Foster cursed in what Helen now recognized as Russian. Enough. We take her now, sort this out later. As Miller stepped forward to search her, headlights suddenly swept across the library windows, illuminating the stacks in harsh white light. Car doors slammed outside. Federal agents. O'Connor's voice boomed through a megaphone. The building is surrounded. Foster's face contorted with rage. He grabbed Helen, pulling her in front of him as a shield. How did they know? The answer came to Helen in a flash of understanding. My assistant didn't call in sick. She saw the pattern too. When I didn't answer the check-in call, O'Connor's voice came again. We have the building surrounded. Release the hostage and surrender. Miller looked frantically at Foster. We still have the extraction plan. The backup route through the loading dock. No. Foster's grip tightened around Helen's throat. She comes with us. Insurance. As they began forcing her toward the back of the library, Helen realized with cold clarity what would happen if they escaped with her. She would be interrogated, perhaps shipped to Moscow, and certainly killed afterward. In that moment of perfect understanding, a strange calm settled over her. The card catalog, she said quietly. Shut up, Foster hissed, dragging her along. The card catalog in my desk. It documents your entire network. Every connection, every pattern, every agent. Foster hesitated, just for a second. You're lying. I'm a librarian, Mr. Foster. Organizing information is what I do. The moment's distraction was all O'Connor needed. The library's rear door crashed open, and FBI agents streamed in, weapons drawn. Down! Get down! Foster shoved Helen aside, reaching for something in his jacket. The gunshot echoed through the reference section, sending dust motes dancing in the beam of a flashlight. Foster crumpled among the books he'd pretended to study. Miller surrendered without resistance, her eyes vacant with the knowledge of what awaited her. As an agent wrapped a blanket around Helen's shoulders, O'Connor approached her. You okay? She nodded, unable to speak just yet. Your assistant called when you missed your check-in. Smart thinking with that system. He looked at her with newfound respect. And the card catalog idea? Brilliant improvisation. Not entirely improvised, Helen admitted shakily. I really did create one. Old habits. Over the following weeks, the FBI used Helen's meticulous records to unravel what proved to be the most extensive Soviet intelligence network ever discovered in the American Midwest. 17 agents were arrested across 5 states. The operation had targeted nuclear facilities, water treatment plants, power stations, and transportation hubs, the critical infrastructure that could be compromised in event of conflict. On a cold December morning, Helen was summoned to Washington. The director of the FBI himself thanked her for her service, presenting her with a letter of commendation that she could never show anyone or speak about. You've done your country a tremendous service, Mrs. Evans, he told her. One that will likely never be publicly acknowledged. Helen returned to Cedar Rapids, to her books and card catalogs and the quiet life she'd built. Occasionally, she would see O'Connor, now reassigned to counterintelligence operations throughout the region. They would nod to each other in passing, sharing the weight of a secret that would remain classified for decades. In 1975, a brief obituary appeared in the Cedar Rapids Gazette for Helen Evans, age 60, noting her years of service to the public library and her work establishing the Iowa Library Association's cataloging standards. It mentioned she was preceded in death by her husband, a World War II pilot. What it didn't mention was the sealed medal in a Pentagon vault, or the KGB file marked Cedar Rapids Compromise, that would remain classified until after the fall of the Soviet Union. It didn't mention how a widow with a passion for organization had exposed a network that the FBI would later determine had placed agents in critical infrastructure positions across 12 states. It simply noted that she had no surviving family and requested that in lieu of flowers, donations be made to the library's reference section. In 1998, during a declassification review of Cold War counterintelligence operations, a junior analyst at the CIA came across File CR 57-238, codenamed Bookkeeper. She read with growing fascination about an ordinary librarian who had exposed one of the most significant Soviet penetrations of the American heartland. The analyst drafted a memo recommending the file for historical preservation. In the justification section, she wrote simply, "Because some heroes catalog books by day and save their country by night, and because history should remember Helen Evans."